Welcome to Storytime with Killian Flynn. Today's story is The House on Hollow Creek. This is a drama suspense mystery story. Lillian Carter had never planned on coming back to Hollow Creek. She had spent 15 years trying to forget the place. The overgrown roads, the empty storefronts, the stares of people who acted like she had never belonged. But when she received the letter from the attorney, informing her that she was now the legal owner of the Carter house, she had no choice. Her grandmother was dead, and the house was hers. She gripped the steering wheel of her car as she drove up the winding, tree-lined path, her stomach twisting in knots. The memories came rushing back. Her childhood summers spent in this house, the way the floorboards creaked at night, the way her grandmother never let her near the attic. Some doors should stay closed, Lillian. That was what Grandmother Carter had always said. Now Lillian was about to open them all. The town of Hollow Creek had changed. Or maybe it had always been this way and she was only noticing it now. The main road was nearly abandoned, the gas station looking like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. The grocery store had a faded sign, and the diner, once a staple of her childhood, was dark, its neon sign flickering weakly. It was as if the entire town was caught in time, slowly decaying. Lillian pulled up to the real estate office, where the attorney had said she needed to sign the final paperwork before she could officially take ownership. As she stepped inside, a small bell jingled above the door, announcing her arrival. The receptionist, a woman in her late 40s, looked up from her desk. Her eyes narrowed slightly as if she recognized Lillian but wasn't sure from where. "Can I help you?" Lillian cleared her throat. "I'm here for the Carter estate." The woman's face changed instantly. She froze, her fingers pausing over her keyboard. A tense silence filled the air. "Oh," the woman said after a moment. "You're her granddaughter." Lillian nodded. The receptionist didn't smile. Instead, she lowered her voice. "You're moving into that house?" Lillian frowned. "I guess so. Why?" The woman hesitated. Then, with a careful glance toward the back office, she whispered, "Don't stay there at night." A chill crawled up Lillian's spine. "Excuse me?" The receptionist swallowed hard. "Just, if you hear something, don't go looking for it." Before Lillian could ask anything else, the attorney appeared, a thin man in a pressed suit holding a stack of papers. His smile was polite but distant. "Ms. Carter." Right on time, and just like that, the conversation was over. But the warning lingered. An hour later, Lillian stood in front of the house. It was just as she remembered. And yet, it felt different. The wraparound porch sagged slightly, the wooden beams weathered and cracked. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tightly closed. A house frozen in time. She inhaled deeply, gripping the old brass key before stepping onto the porch. The wood creaked beneath her feet. She ignored the prickling sensation at the back of her neck and pushed the key into the lock. The door swung open with a groan. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the scent of aged wood, dust, and something faintly floral. Her grandmother's perfume, still clinging to the air after all these years. She stepped inside, her boots echoing softly against the hardwood floors. The house felt untouched, as if Grandmother Carter had simply walked out one day and never returned. The furniture was still in place. The old grandfather clock in the hallway still ticked softly, filling the silence with its slow, rhythmic pulse. A sense of unease settled over her. It was too quiet, even for an empty house. Lillian set her bags down and ran a hand along the wooden banister of the staircase. The dust stuck to her fingertips. She turned toward the kitchen, expecting to find the same worn-out tile floors and cluttered countertops from her childhood. Instead, she froze. On the kitchen table sat a single teacup, and beside it, an open book. Like someone had just been sitting there, Lillian's pulse spiked. She hadn't touched anything. No one had been in the house for months, so why did it feel like someone still lived here? She swallowed hard and approached the table. The book was old, the pages yellowed and fragile. The title read, "The History of Hollow Creek." Lillian frowned, flipping to the marked page. Her breath caught as she read the first line. On November 2nd, 1946, William Carter disappeared from his home on Hollow Creek. Her grandfather? Lillian's throat went dry. She flipped the page, scanning the text. No record of him ever leaving. No body found. Just gone. Just like all the other missing people in Hollow Creek. A sudden creak from upstairs made her blood run cold. Lillian's head snapped toward the staircase. The attic door was open. A chill crawled down her spine. She took a slow step back. Then from above, a single deliberate footstep. Lillian's pulse hammered in her chest. The attorney had said the house had been empty for months. So who, or what, was up there? She took a shaky breath. She had two choices: leave now, or finally find out what her grandmother had been hiding. Lillian clenched her fists. She was done running from the past. With slow, steady steps, she moved toward the staircase, placing her hand on the wooden railing. The air felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. She climbed, one step at a time, up toward the attic door that should not have been open, up toward the answers she had spent her whole life avoiding, up toward the truth. And as she reached the top, the attic door slammed shut. The attic door slammed shut, rattling the walls. Lillian stopped mid-step, her breath catching in her throat. A cold chill rolled over her skin, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She wasn't imagining this. Someone or something was up there. She waited, listening. Silence. Then, a creak. A slow, deliberate shift of weight against the wooden attic floor. Lillian swallowed, her pulse hammering. If she left now, she could pretend none of this had happened. She could turn around, drive back to the city, and sell the house from a distance. But something deep inside her refused to move. Something told her this moment was inevitable. She had spent her whole life running from Hollow Creek, from this house, from the truth. Now she had to face it. Lillian reached for the attic door handle. It was ice cold. She twisted it slowly and pushed the door open. The attic. The first thing she noticed was the dust. Thick, untouched, except for a single set of footprints leading to an old wooden trunk. Lillian's chest tightened. Who had been up here? Grandmother Carter had never allowed her near the attic. Some doors should stay closed, Lillian. She forced herself forward, her footsteps stirring the dust in the stagnant air. The room was cluttered with old boxes, covered furniture, and yellowed newspapers stacked in neat piles. Her eyes locked onto the wooden trunk at the end of the footprints. It looked ancient, the brass lock rusted and brittle. Lillian crouched in front of it. The lock was unfastened, almost like someone had been here before her and had wanted her to find this. She hesitated, heart pounding, then slowly lifted the lid. Inside, the trunk was filled with old photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten letters. On top of it all, there was a portrait, a black and white photo of a man. Lillian recognized him immediately. Her grandfather, William Carter, the man who had disappeared from this very house in 1946. The missing pages. Lillian's hands trembled as she flipped through the old photographs. Each one showed William Carter in different places. Standing on the front porch, sitting by the fireplace, holding a small child she knew was her father. He looked normal, happy, but then the photographs changed. The later ones were wrong. William's face looked hollow, his eyes sunken, his expression vacant. And in the last photograph, taken just days before he disappeared, he was standing at the attic window, looking outside, looking at... Lillian's throat tightened. There was something in the background of the photo, a dark figure standing in the yard just beyond the trees, tall, motionless, watching. She flipped the photo over. On the back, written in her grandmother's delicate script, were 3 words. It took him... Lillian's breathing shallowed. She reached for one of the letters in the trunk. It was addressed to her grandmother. She unfolded it carefully, the edges brittle with age. The handwriting was William's. It read, "Eleanor, I see it again. At night in the trees, watching me. It wants something. I think it knows I've seen it. If anything happens to me, do not let Lillian near this house." Lillian's blood ran cold. She flipped through the other letters. More of the same. Descriptions of something outside the house. Something only William could see. And then one last note. The ink was smudged, frantic. "I heard it in the attic." Lillian's breath hitched. She was in the attic. She hadn't heard anything yet. But what if she wasn't supposed to? What if it was still watching? The attic window. She turned toward the dust-covered window. Her chest tightened as she slowly stepped forward, placing a trembling hand against the glass. The yard outside was dark, but the trees swayed gently in the breeze. It looked normal. But then a shadow moved, a shape barely visible against the tree line. Lillian's stomach twisted. She leaned in closer, heart hammering. The figure was standing there, watching, just like in the photograph. Her blood turned to ice. It hadn't been a coincidence. It hadn't been just an old story. It was still here, and now it knew she had seen it. A sudden, sharp knock echoed through the house. Lillian spun around, heart slamming against her ribs. The sound had come from downstairs. She hesitated, her mind racing. It was late. No one should be here. No one should be knocking. Unless... Lillian grabbed one of the letters from the trunk, clutching it as if it were a lifeline, and slowly made her way back down the stairs. The house felt different now. The shadows seemed deeper, the air thicker. She reached the front door, pausing just inches away. The knocking had stopped, but something felt off. She peeked through the curtain. The porch was empty. No one was there. Her stomach twisted. Had she imagined it? Had she... Knock. The sound came again. Lillian's breath hitched. Not from the front door, from the back of the house. She turned sharply, her pulse roaring in her ears. Someone or something was knocking on the back door. Lillian's fingers trembled as she stepped toward the kitchen, toward the narrow hallway leading to the back entrance. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave. But she was done running. She reached for the doorknob and slowly pulled it open. The night was silent. The backyard stretched into darkness, the trees swaying gently under the dim glow of the porch light. Lillian stepped outside cautiously, scanning the yard. Nothing. No footprints, no shadows, just the quiet hum of the wind. She let out a slow breath. Maybe she was just on edge. Maybe her foot hit something. She looked down. A piece of folded paper lay on the porch. She bent down, fingers shaking as she picked it up. It was old, the edges yellowed and torn. She slowly unfolded it. One sentence, scrawled in familiar handwriting, her grandfather's. It's inside the house. The paper trembled in Lillian's grip. It's inside the house. Her grandfather had written those words, but when? And if he had known, why hadn't he left? Lillian's pulse pounded as she lifted her gaze toward the dark windows of the house. Something about them felt wrong now, like something was looking back at her. She swallowed hard, stepping backward toward the porch door. The wooden slats creaked under her weight, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing. She had come back to Hollow Creek to find answers. Instead, she had found something waiting for her, something that had been there long before she arrived. And now, it knew she had read the note. It knew she had seen it. And it wasn't hiding anymore. A house that wasn't empty. Lillian stepped back inside, locking the door behind her. The house felt different now. The air was heavier, the silence stretched too thin. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. She pressed her back against the door, straining to listen. For anything. A creak. A whisper. A breath that didn't belong to her. Nothing. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm her racing heart. Think, Lillian. If something is inside, what does it want? She looked down at the crumpled note in her hand. Her grandfather had tried to warn her. Had he left this note for her? Or had it been here all along, waiting to be found? Lillian's grip on the paper tightened. There was only one way to find out. She had to keep looking. The missing pages. She hurried back to the attic, her mind buzzing with questions. The trunk was still open, the scattered letters exactly where she had left them. She rifled through the papers, searching for anything that might explain what had happened here. Then she found it. A journal. Old. The leather cracked. The pages yellowed with time. It was her grandmother's. She turned to the first page, her breath catching as she read the date. November 2nd, 1946. The day her grandfather disappeared. Lillian's hands shook as she flipped through the entries. Her grandmother had written in a frantic, urgent hand, the words scrawled like she had been writing in fear. He's been acting strange, staring at the trees at night, mumbling about something watching him. I tell him to come inside, but he won't listen. I think he's afraid. Lillian swallowed hard and turned the page. William didn't sleep last night. He sat by the attic window watching. He says he saw something move in the trees. Something big, something with eyes that don't blink. The next entry was smudged, like her grandmother had been writing in a hurry. He says it's coming for him. He says he's seen its face. Lillian's stomach twisted. She turned the page again and stopped. There was a final entry. Just 5 words, scrawled so violently that the ink had bled through the paper. It's inside the house now. Lillian's blood ran cold. Her grandmother had known. She had known something was coming. Something that had taken William Carter. And now, it was still here. Waiting, watching. And Lillian had just walked right into its trap. The footsteps in the hallway. A sound snapped her back to reality. A slow, deliberate creak. From outside the attic door, Lillian's entire body went still. The floorboards groaned again like someone was standing there, listening, waiting. Her breath came fast and shallow. She glanced around the attic, searching for a weapon. Something, anything? Her eyes landed on an old rusted fire poker, leaning against a stack of boxes. She grabbed it, gripping the metal so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then a knock, slow, rhythmic. Knock, knock, knock. Lillian's lungs locked, her pulse hammering against her ribs. She knew. Deep down, she knew. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a burglar. It was what had taken her grandfather. It was what had been watching from the trees. And now, it was standing right outside the attic door, waiting for her to open it. A choice. She never wanted to make Lillian's fingers tightened around the fire poker. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to pretend she had never come back to Hollow Creek. But it was too late now. She had seen it. She had heard it. And now, it was her turn to make a choice. Stay inside the attic and wait for it to leave. Or open the door and face whatever was waiting on the other side. She took a slow, shuddering breath and reached for the handle. The air grew colder, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Her fingers brushed the metal knob, and the knocking stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that felt alive, pressing against her ears. Then, just as her fingers curled around the handle, a whisper came from the other side of the door. Lillian. Her blood turned to ice. She hadn't told anyone she was coming back. No one in this town should have known she was here. No one, and yet, it had said her name. Lillian yanked her hand back, her breathing ragged. No, she wasn't ready. Not for this. Not yet. She took a step away from the door, her body trembling. And as she did, the door handle began to turn, slowly, deliberately. Lillian's chest seized as she gripped the fire poker, bracing herself. The door creaked open an inch, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. She held her breath, every muscle frozen in fear. Then, a hand reached through the gap. A human hand, pale, thin, fingertips blackened at the edges, like they had been burned. The hand twitched, fingers flexing. Lillian's heart slammed against her ribs. She stepped back, and the hand lurched forward, grabbing her wrist. The hand gripped Lillian's wrist, cold, impossibly strong, and wrong. Her breath hitched, every muscle in her body screaming to pull away. But she couldn't. The fingers tightened, pressing against her skin with an unnatural chill. Her pulse hammered, and then it pulled, hard. Lillian stumbled forward with a sharp gasp, her body colliding with the attic door. She barely had time to react before she saw it. The arm attached to the hand. It wasn't just pale, it was grayish, almost translucent. The veins darkened like something rotting from the inside. And it wasn't just human, not anymore. The fingers flexed, their grip almost testing her. Then, from beyond the darkness, came the whisper again. Lillian, this time it wasn't just a voice. It was her grandfather's voice. The fight to break free. A shock of horror raced through her veins. No, that wasn't possible. William Carter was dead. He had disappeared 77 years ago. He wasn't supposed to be here. And yet, this thing knew her name, knew her family, knew exactly how to make her doubt herself. Lillian's breath came fast, her heart slamming against her ribs. Then, the fingers tightened again, yanking her forward. She snapped out of it. No! She wasn't going with it. With a surge of adrenaline, she swung the fire poker, slamming it down against the hand. A sickening crunch echoed through the attic. The grip loosened just enough for her to tear her wrist free. She stumbled back, gasping for air. The thing beyond the door did not scream. It just went still, like it was waiting, like it was thinking, and then the hand retreated into the darkness. The attic door slammed shut with a force so strong that dust rained from the ceiling. And just like that, the silence returned. The letters that told the truth. Lillian's legs felt weak as she collapsed onto the attic floor. Her wrist ached where it had grabbed her, the skin icy cold to the touch. She stared at the door, heart pounding. It was gone. For now. But she knew better than to think it had left. She had felt the intelligence in that grip, the way it had tested her. It was waiting, and it would come back. Her eyes flickered back to the trunk of letters and documents. She needed answers. Now, shoving aside the fear crawling up her spine, she grabbed the remaining letters and began flipping through them. There, the final entry from her grandmother's journal. Lillian scanned the words, her hands shaking. William is gone? The house took him. It knows I know. It whispers at night. It waits by the attic door. If anyone finds this, you must bury the house. Do not stay. Do not listen to it. Do not let it know your name. Lillian's stomach twisted. Her grandmother had tried to warn her, but she had already failed. The house did know her name, and now it wasn't letting her leave. The sound from below, a thud, echoed from downstairs. Lillian's head snapped up. The floorboards groaned beneath unseen weight. Something was moving downstairs. Her entire body tensed. She listened, straining against the silence. Another thud. Heavy, slow, deliberate, like footsteps. But they weren't walking. They were dragging. Lillian's throat went dry. She had one choice. She could stay in the attic, wait until morning, and hope that whatever was down there didn't come back for her. Or she could finish this, whatever was in this house. It had taken her grandfather. It had nearly taken her, and she was done being afraid. Lillian grabbed the fire poker and stood up. She was going downstairs. The descent, the house felt colder now. The moment she stepped out of the attic, she felt it. The weight pressing against her chest, the thick stillness in the air. Something was watching her. She tightened her grip on the fire poker and made her way down the staircase. The wooden steps groaned under her weight, each step echoing through the silence. The dragging footsteps continued below, slow and deliberate. Lillian reached the bottom of the stairs and turned toward the living room. The fireplace was cold, the air thick with dust and age. But the footsteps had stopped. Something was in the house, waiting, listening. Her fingers trembled against the fire poker as she took another step forward. And then the whisper came again. Lillian, she whirled around. And there it was, a figure standing in the hallway, tall, thin, human-shaped but wrong. Its limbs too long, its face too smooth, as if it had been stretched into something inhuman. And its eyes were black pits, bottomless voids that reflected nothing. It took a step toward her, and this time, it smiled. Lillian's blood ran cold. It was her grandfather's smile, but it wasn't him. Not anymore. The air grew thick. The walls seemed to pulse. The house was changing. Lillian took a slow, shuddering breath. She had to end this. She had to finish what her grandmother couldn't. With one last burst of courage, she did the only thing she could. She ran straight at it. Lillian charged forward, gripping the fire poker so tightly that her fingers ached. The figure in the hallway didn't move. It just stood there, its twisted, stretched smile frozen in place. Its black eyes locked onto her, unblinking, unchanging, waiting, daring her. She swung the fire poker with everything she had, the sharp edge cutting through the thick air, and passed right through it. Lillian stumbled forward, nearly losing her balance. The thing hadn't flinched, hadn't reacted, as if it wasn't really there, or worse, as if it wanted her to swing. Her breath came fast and sharp. The air grew thick, pressing in on her chest like a heavy weight. The house was closing in, and then the thing moved. It didn't step, didn't walk. It shifted, like a shadow stretching across the wall. 1 second it was in front of her. The next, it was behind her. And this time, it whispered in her ear, "You belong here now." The house that never let go. Lillian's lungs locked as she stumbled back, swinging wildly behind her. But there was nothing there. The figure was gone. The whisper had vanished, but the house felt different now. She could feel it in the walls, the floor beneath her feet. The entire place had shifted. The Carter house was alive, and it had been waiting for her return. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Lillian's heart jumped into her throat. She turned to the front door, breath catching. Someone was outside, or something. A shadow moved behind the frosted glass window. She took a slow step forward, then another. Her body screamed at her not to, but something pulled her forward. A memory, a feeling. Like she had done this before, like she had stood at this very door in another lifetime. Lillian reached for the doorknob. Her fingers barely grazed it when knock, knock. Knock, louder this time, more insistent, like whoever was on the other side knew she was hesitating. She exhaled sharply, and slowly she turned the handle. The stranger in the fog. The front door creaked open, revealing the cold night beyond. The fog had thickened, curling around the porch steps like long fingers. And in the middle of it, a man stood motionless. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of a wide, weathered hat, his long coat damp from the mist. Lillian swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The man didn't speak. Not at first. He simply tilted his head, studying her. Then, in a low, gravelly voice, he said, "You need to leave." Now, Lillian's pulse spiked. "What?" The man's jaw clenched. "Get in your car. Drive away. And don't ever come back." Lillian's chest tightened. Everything inside her screamed that he was telling the truth. That if she left now, she might still be able to walk away from whatever was happening here. But then she heard it. A whisper from inside the house. "Lillian, don't go." Her blood turned to ice. She turned sharply. The house was watching, waiting, daring her to leave. Or worse, daring her to stay. She looked back at the man. His face was grim. His hand twitched at his side like he wanted to grab her. "This place doesn't let go," he said. "If you stay, it will take you too." Lillian's breath came fast. She had a choice. Leave now, walk away, drive back to the city, forget about the house forever. Or stay and finish what her grandfather started. The answer should have been easy. It wasn't, because deep down she knew she had never really escaped Hollow Creek. And now, it was calling her home. The final choice. Lillian clenched her fists, her eyes locked onto the darkened house, its windows empty, its walls still humming with something unseen. She had spent 15 years running from this place, 15 years pretending she wasn't haunted by her own past. She could leave. She could pretend none of this ever happened. But the truth was, she needed to know. She needed to understand. Lillian slowly turned back to the stranger. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "I'm staying." The man's face darkened. A storm rolled in his eyes, but he didn't argue. He just let out a slow, weary sigh. "Then God help you." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the fog. Lillian watched him go, her chest tight. Then she stepped back inside the house and closed the door behind her. The house that waited. The silence settled around her like a second skin. Lillian exhaled, turning toward the staircase. The house was waiting, and this time she wasn't running from it. She was walking straight into it. Step by step, she climbed the stairs. Back to the attic. Back to the truth. Back to whatever had been waiting for her all these years. She reached the attic door, placed her hand on the handle, and turned it. The door swung open. The darkness swallowed her whole, and the house whispered its final welcome. Thank you for listening to Storytime with Killian Flynn. If you like his stories, go ahead and read some of his books. Check out his bio, links in description. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe to this podcast.